In May of 2003, the world was treated to a spectacle that it would not soon forget. I'll bet you remember it. The Iraq War had started about 2 months earlier. And in those 2 months, the American and Allied forces had actually made some incredible advances. They had gone to Baghdad, they had taken Baghdad, and were effectively in charge of the government. And so, in May of that year, the American President Bush took something of a victory lap. He flew onto an aircraft carrier that had recently returned from the Persian Gulf, landing in a flight suit. And then he stood in front of a sign that declared "Mission Accomplished," and he announced the end of major combat in Iraq. It is an event I hardly need to describe to you because you all remember it. Everyone remembers it. And in fact, I probably would only need to say a few key words like Bush and aircraft carrier and flight suit, and you could conjure up the entire picture in your heads, right? Even though it happened over 10 years ago, people remember it. And people don't remember it, I think, because it had all the pageantry of a photo op and political stunt, though it certainly had all of that. No, people remember it because it was very swiftly shown to be tragically empty and meaningless. Very shortly after that event, it became all too clear to everyone that major combat was far from over in Iraq, that the mission had certainly not been accomplished, and that things were going to get a whole lot worse in Iraq before they got any better, if indeed they ever got much better. People remember that event because it showed up everything that was wrong with the whole situation. Now, I don't bring up that event today because I have any particular axe to grind with President Bush or the Iraq War. I simply bring it up as an example of the kind of event that a society will remember. An event like that shows up the flaws in the system is one that rather stays in our memory. It is fresh 10 years later, and I would suggest to you that even 10 or 20 years from now, people will still remember it. People will still be able to conjure up the picture of that event, even if they didn't see it the first time around. And I mention that because we happen to know that the Gospel of Matthew was written 10 or maybe 20 years after a similar mission accomplished event. It happened in the year 66 AD. And interestingly enough, it happened as a result, even though it happened in Rome, it happened as the result of the end of a war, or at least what was supposed to be the end of a war in Iraq and Iran, or as it was known at the time, the Kingdom of Parthia. Now, you don't need to know a lot about that war, but basically what had happened was that the Roman Empire had been at war with the Kingdom of Parthia for years. And they had been at war over a little kingdom called Armenia that lay between them. For years, Rome had controlled Armenia by naming every king that sat on the throne. Parthia didn't like that. And so for years, these two great superpowers of the world, Rome and Parthia, had warred over Armenia. And in the years leading up to 66 AD, basically the Romans bungled the war with Parthia. They lost a number of significant battles, and the result was that Rome had to create a peace with Parthia. So a peace treaty was written up that was absolutely humiliating to the Roman Empire. The peace treaty was basically this. The king of Parthia would name the new king of Armenia, and he named his own brother and put him on the throne. And Parthia would retain the right to name all future kings and heirs to the throne of Armenia. The only thing the Romans got was the right to crown the king that the Parthians named. Yeah, you heard that right. The Parthians got to pick the king, and then the Romans had to crown him. So the Parthians got everything. They got complete and utter control, and the Romans got an empty, meaningless, symbolic act. But in 66 AD, the emperor, Roman emperor, a fellow named Nero, you've maybe heard of him, decided to turn this meaningless symbolic act into a grand spectacle. And so Nero ordered the king of Armenia to come to Rome to receive his crown. So the Armenian king, a Parthian, brother to the king of Parthia, came to Rome. And it was an incredible spectacle. All of the Roman Empire was excited by the arrival of the king of Armenia. People all along the route, as they made their way to Rome, turned out. Huge crowds. And among the delegation that traveled with the new king were a number of priests of the god, the Parthian god Zoroaster. These priests were astrologers and philosophers. They were called by the Parthians Magi. And if anything, the Romans were far more excited to see these Magi than they were to see the king. They were figures of mystery. They were wise men. They were powerful. And Rome was starstruck by the arrival of these Magi. So the king and the Magi came into the presence of the Emperor Nero. They knelt down and paid him homage, hailing him as the ruler of the whole world. Even though everyone knew it was a lie and that Nero had absolutely no power in Parthia. And then Nero placed a diadem on the king's head. And he threw a great big party for all of Rome. It was an incredible, wonderful day. And the historians call it the Golden Day. So memorable was it. Afterwards, the Magi returned home, returning by a different route from the one they had taken to come. And then Nero did something really extraordinary. He took the extraordinary step of closing the doors to the Temple of Janus in Rome. That's only significant because, you see, the Romans only closed those doors when they were at peace with all their enemies. So by closing the doors, what Nero was saying was he was declaring an end of major combat. He was saying that he had brought peace on earth, goodwill to all men. It was all, of course, a sham, and it meant nothing. Within a few months, the doors to the Temple of Janus were open again. Rome was back at war. And indeed, a war with Parthia raged on for another 5 decades, causing untold sorrow and damage. Nero's little publicity stunt had accomplished absolutely nothing. And everybody knew it. Everyone knew it right away. And so I suspect that that event, the visit of the Magi to Rome, was remembered and talked about and passed down And for years, 10, even 20 years later, I'll bet that all you had to do was mention a few key words, like king and magi, and knelt down and paid him homage, and returned home by a different route. And people knew exactly what you were talking about. Well, it turns out that 10 or at most 20 years after the events that took place in 66 AD, Nero's mission accomplished event, a man that we know as Matthew took up his pen and wrote the gospel that bears his name. I just can't think that it's just a coincidence that after a few initial remarks, Matthew started his story of the birth of Jesus with an account of some Magi who traveled from Parthia, because that's where Magi were found, to find the king, that they knelt down and paid him homage, and then returned home by a different route. It's not a coincidence. Now, I don't know exactly what information Matthew had about an actual visit of actual Magi to the home of Mary and Joseph sometime after Jesus was born. I don't doubt that he did indeed have sources, stories, and traditions passed down by the early church that he used to write his account of the birth of Jesus, as well as passages from the Old Testament. But I also don't doubt that he went out of his way to tell his story in such a way as to remind his readers of the events that had taken place in Rome, of Nero's mission accomplished event. Now, why would he do that? Why would he go out of his way to remind his readers of what we would see as a purely political event? Well, you see, it wasn't just a political event. Because Nero wasn't just a political leader. As Roman emperor, he was also hailed as a god. And so that whole spectacle, when the priests of a foreign god came down and knelt down and paid him homage, was as much about proclaiming Nero's political power and as proclaiming his divinity. And so, yes, Matthew would have seen a connection. And Matthew wouldn't have minded one bit reminding his readers of those events. Because for him, it showed up such an incredible contrast between the Roman emperor and the king that he followed. Because the mission accomplished event showed up the Roman Empire for an empty sham. Showed up the emperor's power as empty and meaningless. Yes, it looked impressive on the outside. It was splendid. In all appearance, Nero had everything. But underneath, it was so empty and so meaningless. And Matthew, you see, he knew of another king who maybe from the outside didn't look so impressive, who was maybe rejected by the power brokers and leaders of this world. But a king who Matthew knew had the power to change everything. Yes, Matthew wouldn't have hesitated to remind his readers of Nero's mission accomplished event, because the contrast for him was just so beautiful. And I think this is important to recognize because, you know what? We still live in a world where so much energy and so much attention is given to the surface of things, the appearance of things, and not enough is given to the substance and the deeper meaning of things. I think it's important because, as you all know, 2015 is going to be an election year in Canada. Whether we like it or not, we're going to have a federal election. And I don't know about you, but I like to think that an election would be a wonderful opportunity for us as Canadians to talk about really important issues, to talk about what matters to us, to talk about what policies really fit with our values and our priorities. To talk about what actually matters about who we are and who we want to be in the world. But really, I wonder how much of that will really happen next year. How much energy will we put into really talking about the important issues, and how much energy will be given to photo ops and things that are all about appearance and how things look, and accusations about how the other guy looks bad. How much will be on that? We tend to put so much energy into that other stuff. And please understand, I'm not really blaming the politicians for that. I know that many of our politicians really would like to talk about and deal with the really important substantive issues. It's bigger than what individual politicians want. It's something about our society and our focus on the exterior, on the appearance, on what it looks like from the outside. And so it's like they have no choice but to put all of their energy into the appearances and the photo ops. But just remember this. When you see a politician standing up there making some announcement, and all of these wonderful, perfect representatives of various ethnic and cultural groups lined up behind them, when you say announcements made of initiatives and priorities that have absolutely no substance whatsoever behind them, when you see committees and commissions set up to study problems and make recommendations that you know very well everyone will ignore, and I promise you, you'll see a lot of that next year. Remember one thing. We have citizenship in another country, in another kingdom. And it is a kingdom that is built on another foundation. On the foundation of a person who came among us to show us in flesh and blood and in action what the face and what the love of God really looks like. That is a kingdom about what really matters. And so we don't need to be taken in by meaningless photo ops and press availabilities and these symbolic actions that are taken that have no substance. We know those things are empty. We know it before anyone else. I don't think Matthew hesitated to remind his readers of Nero's mission accomplished event in Rome in 66 AD. The contrast to him was beautiful. The contrast between the empty, meaningless power of a Roman emperor and the deep, meaningful power of the Messiah who had come into the world to change this world. And Matthew knew that if the Messiah had come to change the world can change, and there is meaning, and there is substance. Would you please take a few moments in silence